Well, we'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot to talk about this evening, so I don't want to waste any more time. But hello, everybody. I am Alex Smith, and with me I have my husband and coworker Brad Smith. We're the extension agents in Hardy and Grant County, and we'll kind of be your hosts for this evening. Just to kind of, before we get into the meat of everything, I just want to do some basic housekeeping. If you can please keep yourself on mute at all times until we get to the question and answer part. It just helps with background noise so that we can hear our speakers clearly. If you're having internet issues and you notice any of us glitching or any of your screen glitching, you may just want to turn your camera off if it's on, because that can sometimes help. If you have questions, if you can wait and put them in the chat box, we'll get to them at the end. And looking at my little list here, I think that pretty much covers the housekeeping. Brad, what else do you have to add?
Well, as we get started this evening, we need to remind everyone that's on tonight to not shoot the messenger. This is an educational program that is designed to make us aware and help us plan how to deal with these changes that are coming. I doubt if there's anyone on here that gets more frustrated and upset than I do about the bureaucracy and red tape and the changes we have to deal with in production agriculture now. So bear with us. This isn't the time or place to fight these changes. They're USDA regulations that are coming down. We have to deal with them, and we've all got to support the judicious use of antibiotics on our farms. With that, I want to introduce or recognize our speakers and folks that are getting on. A couple I haven't seen on yet, but tonight we have with us Dr. Scott Bowdridge. We have Rosie Bush is going to be our feature speaker. We have Dr. Erica Alt. Dr. Alt is the West Virginia Assistant State Veterinarian who will be able to help answer some questions and maybe make some comments as we go along. And if they can get on, I know Dr. Darren Matlick, who is the WVU Extension Veterinarian, and Dr. Vanessa Harper, who is the USDA APHIS vet for West Virginia, will be trying to join us and help answer some of these questions. But to start off with, I want to introduce Dr. Bowdridge, and then I'll ask you to go ahead and introduce Rosie, if you would, Scott. Scott is Associate Professor in Food Animal Science at WVU Davis College of Ag and Natural Resources and Design. He works closely with Extension. We have Scott collaborating with us on several research projects and programs that we work with in Extension. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Brad, and thank everybody for coming tonight. This is an important topic that we all need to be aware of and just kind of be prepared for. I got notified of this just with my experience with my family that operates sheep in Northern California. And I'm going to share a screen real quick as I go through this. Yeah, I'm going to do this. There we go. So you guys can see this now. I've just highlighted a few commonly used drugs that are pretty much in everybody's cabinet. In California, coccidiostats, penicillin, tetracyclines are all restricted drugs. So this is what's coming down the line for us eventually across the country by June of 2023, is that you will have to have a veterinary client-patient relationship before you can actually purchase or get a prescription for any of these drugs. Now, this is a part of the FDA's push towards mitigating the development of antibiotic resistance. And if you've heard me talk before about anything, you've heard a lot about anti-parasitic resistance. So this is kind of in line with that a little bit, but just more regulated from the federal government side. So the push behind this is just kind of a movement towards antibiotic stewardship. And there's a quote that I pulled from a paper that I thought was interesting. So to safeguard the efficacies of these life-saving medicines, medically important antibiotics should be used in food animal production only to treat disease that has been diagnosed by a licensed veterinarian or in limited circumstances to control a verified disease outbreak. So what they're trying to do as a part of this is to get veterinarians a little bit more involved in production systems, which on the face of it and face value, I'm a small ruminant producer. We are always kind of been out on our own trying to figure these kind of things out. But I think having a veterinarian involved can be a good thing in the long run. What I want everybody to take away from this is that while there's some federal regulations coming down the line to limit what we do and limit how and our access to some of these medically important drugs, I think we've got some opportunities as farmers and ranchers to deal with this. So from a state and federal government standpoint, I think that there's an opportunity for the government to incentivize non-antibiotic interventions for disease prevention. So as a researcher and as somebody who's involved in that standpoint,
You're on this thing on raising
ways,
it, button your food.
No, the button down here.
we're thinking about ways to identify and classify different production strategies as interventions for non-antibiotic use. For farmers and ranchers, it's actually utilizing those non-antibiotic prevention strategies. So developing a biosecurity plan, working with your veterinarian to develop SOPs for treatment of disease, to eliminate kind of routine use of antibiotics for disease prevention and rather disease control. So these are just a couple of small things that I wanted to remind everybody about when we talk about something that can get a little bit emotional, is that we can turn it into something positive as we work through this. Now, when I attended the American Sheep Industry meeting in January, I had the privilege of listening to Dr. Bush talk about this. And it got me excited about it because she stood up in front of a room full of producers and took it straight in the teeth and did a fantastic job of demonstrating the background behind this, the veterinary perspective, the producer perspective of this, and kind of the rationale for how to make it work for everybody. So Dr. Bush is a California native. She did all of her degrees at UC Davis. And while I did mine somewhere else in California, I went to the cheaper school. She went to the fancy school in California, got her DVM from UC Davis, went into practice for a little bit, and is, if you want to think about this from a larger standpoint, is the state sheep and goat extension veterinarian. How lucky is that state to have somebody in that role? And we are really lucky to have Rosie with us tonight. And I'm just going to open up the floor for her to give her presentation.
Thank you so much. That was probably the best introduction I've ever had. Appreciate it. All right, let's see if I can do this. All right. So yeah, I have been the state extension vet for sheep and goats for the last 2.5 years. Before me, we had a gap for like 20 years. So it took a lot of push to get this position filled again. So I'm very excited to be here and doing that. So we'll just get right into it. Antibiotic resistance. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Is that working all right? Perfect. Okay, great. Antibiotic resistance, the reason why it is regulated so differently than what you're all very well familiar with antiparasitic resistance or resistance to dewormers is because antibiotics are also used in human medicine. So antibiotic resistance is a global threat to both human health and animal health. Some of the consequences that we see to antibiotic resistance are simple infections become really difficult to treat. They take longer to treat, and which means we have increased costs, and we are more likely to have both people and animals die from resistant infections just because treatments aren't as effective. All right, so this is a really short video. I think it's only like 2 minutes long, but it's kind of neat. It shows how quickly these bacteria can evolve to have resistant genes in them. So
Rosie, was there audio with this?
can you not hear the audio?
No, we can't hear the audio.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, let me try. So those different numbers were related to the concentration of antibiotics. This is a huge bacterial growth plate that these researchers from Stanford used. And so first they put bacteria on either side where there are no antibiotics, and then those bacteria can move in this auger. And so they grow until they get to the point where their population is basically starving because they're running out of food and they're crowded. And so something has to change. So they evolve and they're able to survive in the next concentration, which has more antibiotics. And you can see that these populations evolve at different time points to be able to survive in these different concentrations of antibiotics in this giant auger plate. So all of those are different mutation points. And this whole study, I think they were able to get to 1,000 times the original concentration of antibiotics in 10 days, which seems really fast, right? In clinics, in hospitals, you can have new antibiotic resistant populations as short as 4 to 5 days. So these antibiotic resistant populations emerge really quickly when enough pressure is applied. So, and you know, bacteria grow really rapidly too, which is another point that comes up a little bit later when we're talking about antibiotic stewardship. So based on that, emergence of resistance is a natural evolutionary response to a pressure. So it could be that, you know, it could have to do with the immune capacity of those animals. It could have to do with the fact that we're using antibiotics. That's a selective pressure. Some bacteria are, we call it intrinsically antibiotic resistant. So an example would be mycoplasma is not affected by penicillin, right? It doesn't have a cell wall. So it is resistant to penicillin. That doesn't mean that it has an acquired resistance gene to penicillin. We just can't use that antibiotic for that bacteria. And then we have a lot of conversations about, okay, well, does it matter about, you know, if E. coli is resistant, that's kind of a commensal, versus the bacteria that we're typically worried about as animal producers or veterinarians is the pathogenic and whether they're resistant. So there's a couple of different conversations happening here between different agencies and producer groups, and these conversations have been going on for quite some time. But what we really see is, you know, how quickly these things develop has to do with how mutable the bacteria are. And then once they have that gene, how much that gene affects its survivability, so the fitness of those bacteria. So sometimes they may acquire or mutate to have a resistance gene, but over time they'll lose it because it doesn't suit them. Bacteria really have to be able to adapt to their environment because they are so affected by their environment. So they can kind of pick up and lose things quickly to make sure that they're able to survive in their environment. So there's really only a few main mechanisms of resistance. We have pumps where the bacteria will just shuttle the drug out of the cell. They can inhibit uptake. They can change the target that the antibiotics affect, or they can inactivate them through different enzymes. And then they can also create new pathways. So if an antibiotic blocks, okay, sorry. But there's really only a couple of main mechanisms. The other thing that bacteria can do is that they can share resistance genes. So they can do that with these little viruses that like to jump on bacteria. They can share through conjugation, or they can just pick up DNA from dead bacteria that are lying around in the environment. So that's why resistance genes can spread so quickly. It's not necessarily a generational thing, even though they do grow so fast, they can pick it up from other bacteria that are around there. And then we know that our communities and just our environment is so interconnected that's where we talk about how these resistance genes can disseminate into our environment, into like hospital effluent, could put potentially resistance genes into water supplies, and how do we deal with that? And so there's a lot of conversations about that environmental part and how the environment can be a reservoir for these resistance genes. So I mentioned briefly about how resistance can persist or not through a population. And again, very, very dependent on the environment that they're in. So this is a study that Dr. Scott at Texas A&M presented a couple of years ago, and comparing the level of resistance, let's see if I can use a pointer here, of resistance after a treatment. So this study on the left was looking at one single dairy cow after 2 doses of ceftiofur. And so you can see that her level of resistance goes up, and then after about 16 days, her level of resistance was way down. Compared to, and these are just 2 examples, so a pen of steers getting some metaphylaxis of 1 dose of ceftiofur, and their level of resistance goes up, and it persists for quite some time, but it is trending downwards. And you can imagine this pen is getting this dose probably right at arrival. And so they have quite some time before slaughter occurs anyways. And so it's very likely that that level of resistance will be down before their feeding period is up. Well, what's the difference between these 2 groups? The single dairy cow, once she is over whatever illness she has incurred, she's going to be mixed back with her milking string. So she will leave the hospital pen and be mixed back with a bunch of cows that haven't received antibiotics. So her environment probably has more bacteria that haven't been exposed to these antibiotics, and so she can trend downwards maybe a little bit faster. So there's a lot of factors that go into how long these genes persist in a bacterial population. So we can also see resistance genes persist for other reasons. So if there's cross resistance, so let's say we have an antibiotic resistance mechanism like this efflux pump that also pumps out heavy metals. So we know that some bacteria are pretty affected by zinc levels. So if that mechanism is the same, then if we may not be using the antibiotics, but if we're using this alternative method of preventing disease or promoting weight gain, it could potentially be maintaining this resistance gene in this population. There's co-resistance where genes are just really close together on the genome, and so maintaining one also encourages the maintenance of the other gene. And then there's co-expression, where they may be on totally different sides of the genome, but they have the same modulator. So the same switch that turns one on also turns on the other. So it gets a little complicated. I don't know about you, but usually by this point in the talk, I feel a little bit like this. But the take-home message is that any time an antibiotic is used, regardless of the indication, there is potential for either adverse effects or development of antibiotic resistance. So you hear a lot of promotional things saying, only, unresponsible use of antibiotics causes resistance. No, truly, anytime we use an antibiotic, we could potentially promote the development of resistance, which is why we want to eliminate the use of antibiotics when they're not needed. And I think everyone's on the same page for that. Antibiotic treatments cost money, and no one wants to just throw money down the drain. So, like we mentioned, the consequences of antibiotic resistance in bacteria of animal origin are not limited to public health. So it's not just a public health issue. We care as animal caretakers that our treatments may not become or may not be as effective later on. And we know that we haven't had a new antibiotic drug labeled for use in livestock in quite some time. So hoping for new effective treatments down the line is probably not our best bet. We want to really make sure we take care of the tools that we have. So a little bit, I'll talk really briefly on where all of this kind of came from, but really regulating antibiotics started in Europe because they were using a drug related to vancomycin in swine and were causing some pretty severe vancomycin resistance problems. So that happened there. The same drug we've never had licensed for use in the United States. So we really didn't have momentum in the US to regulate antibiotics specifically for quite some time. The Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act was passed in 1994. This is the first time we started looking at drugs that maybe shouldn't be used in livestock for many reasons. But it does allow the extra label use of drugs with the involvement of a veterinarian. So the drugs that have been prohibited so far are because they can be carcinogenic. The blue names are classes of drugs that are antibiotics. So there's some that have been prohibited because they're carcinogenic, some because they have toxic reactions. And then more recently, antibiotics have been prohibited for extra label use because of concerns for antibiotic resistance. So really recently, CDC has been trying to really understand what the antibiotic resistance threats are. In 2013, they put out this first report on resistant levels in hospitals, and that was the first time they really tied certain bacteria to potential foodborne pathogens. And that's really when a lot of this kind of finger pointing started, but it got a lot of good conversations going. FDA regulates these drugs, and so you can see right around 2012 is when GFI 209 came out, which really kind of outlined what their future goals were for promoting the judicious use of these medically important antibiotics. And that medically important, it's basically saying the antibiotics that are used in both food producing animals, or really in animals, and in human medicine. So things like coccidiostats are not considered medically important antimicrobials because they are not used in human medicine. All right, and then recently we have more, so these guidance for industry documents are for drug manufacturers. So they're not something that we necessarily have to comply with. They are basically setting labeling standards for the drug manufacturers. So that's where it'll be a label change for these drugs going from over-the-counter to prescription status. And let's see. So this is different from the national VFD rule that occurred back in 2017, and that brought all antibiotics that were in feed and water, and those that were in feed required a VFD. Those that were in water went to prescription, and really that that only affected livestock. In 2017, they put out a summary report after this change occurred. And you can see that most of the antibiotics that are used in livestock are in feed and water. Now, that said, the potency is certainly different for those drugs that are in feed and water versus the ones that are given by injection or drench. So that changes some of these numbers a little bit. It's not apples to apples. But a general overview, after that occurred, there was certainly a decline in those antibiotics that were used in those livestock species. And it did rebound a bit, and they assume that's because that first year it was kind of a hardship to figure out how to adapt to these changes and how to get a VFD from a veterinarian. So you can see it did rebound a little bit, but really not too much. So again, most of the changes occurred in feed and water because that's what those regulations were affecting. Around the same time, both California and Maryland had this very similar state laws that were passed that took all over-the-counter injectable and other forms of antibiotics to have a prescription ordered by a licensed veterinarian. And this occurred kind of right before FDA published their 5-year plan, which is where they outlined the change that we're talking about today. So GFI 263 was finalized on June of 2021, and this is the one that basically outlines the process for drug sponsors or manufacturers to transition the marketing status from over-the-counter to prescription. So right now, as you saw from Dr. Bowdridge, those drugs say California restricted. Now they'll just all say prescription because California can't change the prescription status of a drug. They can just restrict its use. And this actually affects all animal species. So it is not just livestock. It also affects dogs, cats, horses. So they gave a 2-year grace period, so it goes into effect in June of 2023 to allow the manufacturers to be able to make those changes. So what does this mean? All of these products that are over the counter currently, and this is just a handful, but kind of the main categories, will require a prescription. For the sheep and goat producers out there, there's only a few that are actually labeled for sheep and goats. So, and Naxal should be there too, but it's already prescription. So these other products did legally require veterinary involvement for use as well. So it gives us a little bit of time to kind of process this information and start developing a relationship with your veterinarian. So that veterinary client-patient relationship is a legal definition. It is there to protect you and to give your veterinarian an idea of what's expected of them. Every state can define their own VCPR, and I didn't look it up for all the states in your area, but for West Virginia, currently, I believe it's the federal definition for what's expected of a veterinarian client-patient relationship. But basically, just in general, it's the veterinarian has assumed the responsibility for making those medical judgments, and they have agreed to communicate those to the client, and the client has agreed to follow the instructions of the veterinarian. The veterinarian has to have enough knowledge of that animal or the operation in order to make at least a general or preliminary diagnosis. And then the veterinarian needs to be readily available for follow-up in case of these adverse reactions that could occur. So, we, especially in the West, and I imagine it's true across the United States, are really concerned about the veterinary shortage, especially with livestock practice. So, what do we do about that? in the NOMS survey for 2011, only 28% of operations were actually visited by veterinarians, and this is sheep operations. At least 52% of operations did consult with a veterinarian. So there is some opportunity to use a veterinarian in a lot of practices, and I know, or in a lot of operations. I know scale can come into play if you only have a few livestock. It's not very often that you have bad things happen per se, but routine visits once a year can really help with management plans and encouraging your local veterinarian to practice with your livestock species. So I know we have a number of small animal practitioners with an interest in working with certain livestock species. They just don't get to see them very often. So if we are engaging with veterinarians on more of a preventative health basis, that can really encourage their kind of confidence and competency with working with different livestock species. So this is Dr. Hake. She's, oh gosh, I know she went to school at Mississippi. I forget where she is, but she's on Instagram, and she's got some great reasons for us for why using a local veterinarian can be really great for not only our operations, but our community as well. So what does it take to maintain or establish and maintain a VCPR? Routine visits might mean something different for different operations. So kind of defining what that might look like for you with your veterinarian. Every relationship is going to be different. There are such things as treatment protocols, but again, every vet client-patient relationship could be different. So just kind of defining that ahead of time, what your potential needs could be for animal health events, sick animals, and then keeping treatment records and then reviewing those together so that you can improve your animal management in the following years. This is a resource that's available at AASRP and just kind of helps outline some of the things that helps really basically define that VCPR. And there is even a herd of record form if that's something that makes you feel comfortable. Telemedicine is something that gets talked about frequently. This is anything that involves phone calls, video chats, and an email exchange. At least in California, we have to have a VCPR established before we can conduct any kind of exchange over these technologies, unless we're trying to triage something. So if it's a true emergency, we can give medical advice for those types of situations. So again, that's going to look different from a state-by-state basis, and I think Dr. Alt can help address questions related to that specifically. How can you get prescriptions? So they can be dispensed by your veterinarian. Most states have a law that says that if you want a prescription, instead of getting it direct from your veterinarian, usually your veterinarian has to provide you one. So a lot of these online pharmacies drop ship pretty quickly. So you can get them through licensed online pharmacies. Some pharmacies in local communities will maintain these drugs. And then another example, in California, we have veterinary food animal drug retailers, which are licensed through the Board of Pharmacy. They just don't have to have a pharmacy on staff at all times. So, you know, potentially there's options for getting prescriptions to communities in ways that are maybe a little bit more flexible. All right, so that's what I have. And happy to take questions, or we can wait. I think if Dr. Alt has something.
Yeah, I can go ahead. Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Erica Alt. I'm the Assistant State Veterinarian for the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. So it's good to be with you guys this evening so I can answer a few of the questions. I think the big take-home messages for everybody on the call tonight is that, again, you know, there's not a whole lot anybody on the call that we're providing you the information can really do this. You know, this has been established by the FDA, and it is a regulation, and, you know, with good reasons and behind it all. But change is hard for everyone. And so this is a huge change for those commonly used drugs that, every livestock producer and a lot of small animal folks are used to being able to, purchase over the counter. So just like the veterinary fee directive, this too it's probably going to take a little while for everybody to just kind of come to terms with it and what that change really means. So I guess some big points too, that now is the time that I would recommend that you seek a veterinarian out so that you can establish that valid veterinarian client-patient relationship, so that you have time to prepare and they can be familiar with you, your operation, your management practices, those type of things. And the added value that you get to using a veterinarian at least once a year to your farm is that, there's health protocols and herd health plans. There's a lot of added value that you can get and a lot of knowledge that you can gather from, your veterinarian. So I strongly encourage you that now is the time to do that. Don't wait until you have an emergency or you really need some of those drugs on hand. I would, like I said, you want to try to establish that as soon as you can, and then talk to your veterinarian about those things. And so the other big reminder to you guys too is that even though a prescription is required, you're not going to be required to purchase those through a veterinarian. So I think that's another big point to take home tonight, is that you can still use online pharmacies, those type of things, but you would still need that prescription and approval from your veterinarian for you to have those maybe shipped to your home. And so, if you guys have questions, your local extension agents, of course, your veterinarians, maybe your Department of Agriculture. I know not everybody on, tonight are, from West Virginia, but we're all here to try to help you get to the right information and how to make this a smoother transition process for everyone. Because like I said, I realize that it is definitely a big change. And so with West Virginia's rules for the veterinarians, with that client-patient relationship that, they have to establish, they do need to see a reasonable amount of animals to make a medical judgment. So they, if you have a herd of 100 animals, they don't necessarily have to see every single one of them in order to, prescribe medication. So they do need to be on your farm at least once a year in West Virginia to kind of establish that. Some states are more restrictive, but that's sort of, West Virginia is an annual basis, at least for the, the herd owner. And then recently, there was a bill that passed through through West Virginia. It's for telemedicine. So just commonly to what Rosie had mentioned, that you will need to have that veterinary client-patient relationship established before you can use the telemedicine as an add-on type of thing. So you still would want to talk to your veterinarian and get that relationship established. But definitely, if you had an emergency, that's going to be an option now in West Virginia for veterinarians to utilize. So definitely keep that in mind. That's going to be a win. So really, I don't know that I can really add any more other than I feel everybody's pain. I realize that it is going to be kind of difficult. And honestly, I think it's probably going to be a little difficult and tricky for the veterinarians too, because there's an overwhelming amount of people that probably never contact them to just get those drugs that they've been getting over the counter. So I think, have some patience with your own veterinarians that you're already working with, because it's going to be a little stressful, I think, just for everybody until we get all the kinks and everything ironed out. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was a good explanations. Trying to flip through the chat box and see if we have any questions so far. We have some good discussion going on in the chat box. Just some comments about the telemedicine and comments on, that the shortage of maybe vets that see small ruminants in West Virginia.
So ASRP also has a Find a Vet resource on their page. And I looked up West Virginia, and there's 3 vets that are listed. So they can choose to be publicly listed or not. But that's a good place to start. And you can, if they're licensed in West Virginia, but reside in a different state, I'm not sure how the licensing works in West Virginia and North Carolina and all that, but there are, that's a good place to start to see if there are people that work with small ruminants anyway.
So we do have a lot of veterinarians that hold, dual license, whether it's in West Virginia and Ohio, like along a lot of the border counties. As long as they're licensed in West Virginia, they certainly can, practice in West Virginia.
Yeah, and we have a lot of remote areas in California with veterinarians that will make that annual trip once a year to establish that relationship and do like preventative procedures, whether it's preg check or whatever that works for that operation. And then they're able to do most of their work through consulting over the phone. It poses a problem for emergencies, as you can imagine. So that's where working with a local vet who may have an interest and kind of working together to build their confidence and competency is, potential, another option.
Seeing just some more discussion in the chat box on just some areas having a vet shortage.
Yeah, and there's the, what is it called? The VMLRP program that helps with trying to recruit veterinarians to areas for mainly livestock practice. And so if you have a shortage, I think, I don't know if we work through extension and through our state to identify those regions that need veterinarians for livestock practice. So I would keep, make it clear that there is a shortage, and that can be potentially something that can help.
Yeah, and actually our state veterinarian, Dr. Maxwell, actually puts a lot of those shortage areas in each year, the different counties in West Virginia. So it's just all, and if you get a veterinarian, of course, to apply and want to serve that service area, for 3 years is what their max time that they have to, to be there. So that is one thing we've, gotten more, but certainly like every other state, there is a shortage of veterinarians, and especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
But I do think the telemedicine part of it, if they're willing to make that annual trip, and then if the rest could be provided by telemedicine and that type of thing, I think it would help out some. So, and what you'll find in West Virginia is that our heavily populated cattle and small ruminant counties usually have, where the population of animals is usually where you have more veterinarians of coverage. But again, those smaller, more areas that don't quite have as many, that's where you don't see as many veterinarians covering those counties, unfortunately. And that's definitely been a problem.
And would you say that maybe potentially, and this is just complete spitballing here, but with this requirement of a VCPR, we would have some of those vets that maybe switched over to large animal or from large animal to small animal, that maybe they, knowing that they'll have that income. I mean, I know I'm not trying to say, anybody's having to spend too much money and anything else, but these people have a job too, and just having that income may keep people able to do the large animals.
Yeah, I know so many students that graduate with an interest in livestock, but in order to pay their loans and all of that, they end up practicing small animals. So those are a lot of the vets that we work with to kind of keep their continuing education going with livestock. And so that when they have the opportunity, a lot of them are excited to get outside and do that work. And, as far as the cost for a vet visit, I think that's why it's got to be tied to an event that that works for your health management plan. Having them out for emergencies is always going to be expensive. So if we can do most of our vet visits on a preventative basis that are planned, and do, those tend to, from like a cost benefit analysis, those tend to pan out a lot better. I don't anticipate those costs going down, because being a mobile vet it's quite more expensive just from fuel and all of those costs associated with the time it takes to drive and all of those things. which is probably why we've seen quite a decline of them. You can
I see we have a question. What is FDA's metrics for success with this initiative? Antibiotic use only.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's how they measure it. So I don't know if they sit and say, yay, antibiotic use has gone down. They probably do. But there are a lot of other researchers that are looking at monitoring trends of antibiotic resistance. Most of those happen at a university basis, especially at diagnostic labs. There's a lot of talk about producing antibiograms, which is basically antibiotic resistance over time for a species of bacteria. And like Kansas State does them, California started doing them. I think Iowa does them as well. So, which is more useful, I think, for veterinarians and producers, because those are the bacteria we're really treating. Most of what FDA measures is through NARMS, which is a CDC, FDA, USDA project. So they're looking at commensals that come through slaughter plants or are on food products. And they're called indicator bacteria. They're there. They don't necessarily cause disease, but if they have a level of resistance, that's how they tend to monitor those. But it doesn't tell us a lot about what antibiotics we should be using for certain diseases. So there is a lot of focus on that with researchers at universities.
So a few more comments in the chat box. There's some discussion, which is great. You guys, a good discussion amongst yourselves is wonderful. Is there going to be any tracking of increased animal loss or an increased level of sickness due to a lack of treatment?
That is a great question. That's the top question we had in California before the law passed here. Not that I know of. It's I think definitely something that there was a lot of concern for, at least in California when things transitioned. We didn't hear as much of this as we heard the concerns for it beforehand. So I think having those relationships in place before 2023, June of 2023, can really help eliminate that concern. It's not that you can't have antibiotics on your place for when a pneumonia pops up, right? We know how quickly they go downhill. So if you're lambing or kidding and you have a protocol for pneumonia, that's something you can work out with your veterinarian for having those drugs on hand so that you can treat the animal as soon as possible. Like I said, bacteria grow really quickly, and sometimes we see infections that don't respond as well to treatment, not necessarily because they were resistant, but because we got to it too late. So that was certainly a concern that we heard before. And like I said, I think a lot of people were able to work with their veterinarian to get those protocols in place so that when they had those things pop up, they were able to manage them.
Another question, is there antibiotic resistance in meat samples that have trended higher?
That is a good question. I haven't looked at that in a little while. There is definitely a trend for antibiotic resistance in certain meat samples. We're very fortunate in the United States. We have a very, an incredible process for meat processing with HACCP and all of that. So a lot of that resistance that maybe we see on farm in those commensal pathogens, that's the other thing, is that we don't really monitor on farm pathogens, even those commensals that they're looking for in meat samples, other than what's at the packing plant. So, where it's occurring in that whole production chain is still a topic of discussion, and a lot of research happening in those areas. But in the US, we do a really good job of trying to minimize the number of pathogens that are on our meat in general. So I think that's something to feel pretty comfortable about. But yeah, there is definitely antibiotic resistance in those populations.
Do we foresee any other medications coming off the market if this antibiotic stewardship is successful?
I don't know. I think this whole, like Dr. Alt said, this conversation's been happening for a couple of decades because of the concern for human health. So these are drugs that cross over between the animal health realm and the human health realm. So that's why they've been focusing on these. So I don't think that we have that concern for other products.
I just wanted to bring up one point with the parasitics that some people are worried about losing the antiparasitics.
Mm-hmm.
The drugs used to treat the parasites, those parasites are specific to agricultural species. So they're not the same worms, but they could be the same bacteria that are in animals that could be in people. So that's where the crossover for antimicrobial resistance becomes important. So they're going to care a little bit less initially about antiparasitics. So just because we don't share a lot of parasites between species. Just in case anybody was worried about that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't worry about ivermectin coming off the shelf necessarily.
We've got lots of good thoughts going on in the chat box.
And I see a lot of questions about economic impact. And just to share, they're not my stories, they're stories from producers in California that they have realized the value of working with their veterinarian. And as far as from an economic perspective, they think that they do better now because they have such a great relationship with their veterinarians. So it's that whole value added, approaching that relationship from a place where you're making sure that you get the information that's going to make, potentially make you more profitable, help you control potential losses sooner. So there's, at least from the stories that we have heard here, we haven't seen the huge losses that was a big concern, just like you guys have.
Are there any other questions? I think we've got everybody thinking, which is great. We have a question about a kid raising a 4-H project.
That's a great question. I think that's going to be where the state can probably help with some creative solutions. When I did work for the state, we kind of talked about the 4-H leader being the agent for the owner. So the leader was able to have that BCPR and we're the agent for the kids in that project. And that was something, again, is going to have to be worked out with the veterinarian and if they're comfortable with that relationship. But it was kind of just a creative solution for helping identify one point person. So every kid in that project didn't have to have like a vet visit, but I think most veterinarians that are working with those projects are willing to work with them on a kind of a group basis, depending on where they're housed and all of that.
Other questions or comments? I don't know if Dr. Harper or Dr. Matlick were able to get on, but I do see Bill Casto. If you have any comments to share or anything, please feel free, unmute yourself. And Dr. Casto is also a USDA APHIS vet serving West Virginia.
I do see another question that popped up. Will you need a prescription? So you will need a prescription to treat pink eye in cattle.
Yep. So that antibiotic that you're using doesn't only affect the bacteria that's causing pink eye, it also affects other bacteria in that animal. And pretty easy to identify disease. So it's more than likely we're using antibiotics for pink eye at the, in the most responsible way. But that's another, pretty simple SOP to have in place. When pink eye occurs, we're going to use this drug that we can have on hand because it's been worked out with your veterinarian.
Bucky Pauling. So to keep from vaccinating to fight pink eye, what's the best vaccination to vaccinate your cows and calves with to keep from getting the pink eye?
That is a great conversation to have. At least out here, I know we have very mixed, responses to the vaccines that are available. Some people really like the autogenous vaccines that they make when they have a pink eye case. Other people, the commercial vaccine works just fine for them, but it seems to be pretty mixed. So it probably depends on what's actually causing the pink eye. There's a couple different bacteria. I know that Dr. Angelos here is working on another study looking at trying to develop a combination vaccine that covers the 3 main bacteria that are causing pink eye in cattle. So still developing in that area.
And we have several producers in the Eastern Panhandle area that are working with their vets to have autonomous vaccines made for the strains that are affecting their herds.
Super. That's great.
Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank everybody that got on and joined us tonight for this discussion and presentation. I want to thank our speakers for agreeing to Zoom over here and help educate about these new FDA requirements coming down the line. So
one comment in introductions that Dr. Bowdridge didn't mention about Dr. Bush. Dr. Rosie Bush is also involved in a podcast, Cheap Stuff You Should Know, that I enjoy listening to. So a plug to that podcast.
Yes, it's a lot of fun. And it's with Dan Macon, who's an extension advisor. I'm super embarrassed. I'm all red now. And he has 120 sheep. So it's kind of that small producer perspective. And then Ryan Mahoney, who owns Amy Livestock, and they have 4,000 to 5,000 sheep and I think 500 beef cows, and then myself. So it's a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
yes, so thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was great.
Yeah.
Hey, Brad, I just want to let you know too, Dr. Casto's speaker was not working. So that's why he couldn't, he had let me know that he wanted me to tell you. So he couldn't talk tonight.
And that's fine. Sorry, I put him on the spot. Didn't mean to do that. I just, if you had any comments, I wanted him to feel free to make them.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't see anything else popping up. And this will be recorded. So if anybody has anybody that would, that they know that would like to see it, or if they want to watch it again, eventually it should be up on an extension page or through our YouTube page, or just try to get a hold of any of us and we'll try to get it to you.
It takes a little while to get it up. We have to get the closed captioning done. The name of the podcast is Cheap Stuff You Should Know.
It's EWE.
We listened to you a lot. We were thinking about it. He's like, I know that name. And then we had to listen to you some more.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, it was
That's
great.
awesome. Very cool.
Oh, we have a 14-year-old that joined us. That's great. It's
Very
always
cool.
great to educate our youth.
Yeah, good job for being here.
Absolutely. Gonna move. Yeah, I have to.